Sarah never thought she'd have a fairy tale life. She didn't grow up rich, and she never expected to marry a millionaire. But she did expect love, real, honest love. And that's exactly what she found with Michael. They met in the most ordinary way, a coffee shop on a rainy afternoon. Sarah had just finished her shift at a small diner, exhausted, when she accidentally bumped into Michael, spilling her drink all over his crisp white shirt. Mortified, she apologized 100 times, but instead of being angry, Michael laughed. "Guess I needed a little excitement today," he had said, flashing that easy, charming smile that would later become her favorite thing about him. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Their love wasn't flashy, but it was solid. They didn't have a lot of money, but they had enough to be happy. Michael worked as an accountant, and Sarah picked up shifts at a local bakery. They lived in a tiny, 2-bedroom house in the suburbs, not much, but it was theirs. On warm summer nights, they'd sit on the porch with cheap wine, dreaming about the future. A family. That was always part of the plan. And then, the day finally came. Sarah stood in their small bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test in her shaking hands. 2 pink lines. Her heart pounded. Excitement, fear, love, everything hit her at once. She ran out of the bathroom, nearly tripping over herself as she found Michael sitting on the couch, flipping through TV channels. "Michael," she breathed, holding up the test. He looked up, confused at first. Then his eyes landed on the test, and his whole face changed. He blinked, then blinked again, like his brain was trying to catch up. "Are you?" His voice cracked, and Sarah could only nod, tears spilling over her cheeks. Michael stood up so fast the remote fell out of his hands. A slow, disbelieving grin spread across his face. "We're having a baby?" Sarah wiped at her tears and laughed. "Actually, twins." For a second, he just stared at her, and then he let out a breathless laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Twins," he repeated, like he couldn't believe it. "We're having twins." The way he looked at her in that moment, like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, made her heart swell. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she thought she might melt into him. "This is everything," he whispered. "Everything." The next few weeks were filled with baby books, name discussions, and nursery plans. Michael joked about learning how to change 2 diapers at once, and Sarah made a ridiculous number of lists: baby clothes, cribs, bottles. Money was tight, but they didn't care. They were in this together. Life felt perfect. But perfect never lasts. Life had never felt more complete. Sarah and Michael were ready for the next chapter, and the thought of becoming parents filled their days with excitement. But happiness is a fragile thing. It can shatter in an instant. It happened on an ordinary evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across their small living room. Sarah was curled up on the couch, one hand resting on her still flat belly, lost in thoughts of the future. She imagined their twins running through the yard, laughter filling the air. Michael had stepped out to pick up a few things for dinner. "I won't be long," he had said, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead before grabbing his keys and heading out the door. But he never came home. The phone rang, breaking the peaceful quiet of the house. Sarah picked up without thinking, expecting Michael to say he'd forgotten something and needed her to check the fridge. But it wasn't him. "Mrs. Thompson?" The voice on the other end was formal, distant. "Yes, this is she," Sarah answered, suddenly uneasy. "I'm calling about your husband, Michael Thompson." A pause. Just long enough for her stomach to drop. "There's been an accident." The words didn't make sense at first. Her brain refused to process them. Michael. Accident. No. That wasn't possible. He had just gone out to grab groceries. He was supposed to be on his way back. I don't understand. Her voice was barely a whisper. The officer continued, each word hitting like a hammer. His car went off the road. We searched the area, but we haven't been able to recover his body. The room tilted. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean you can't find him? There was a long pause, and then a softer, almost regretful tone. We believe the current may have taken the car into the river. It's likely the body was swept away. Her knees buckled. She sank to the floor, gripping the phone as if it were her only tether to reality. Michael. Gone. Just like that. The next few days passed in a haze. Friends and family gathered around, but their words meant nothing. There was no closure, no final goodbye. Just an empty space where Michael used to be. And then, as if losing him wasn't enough, the real nightmare began. A week after the accident, there was a knock at the door. Sarah wiped her tired eyes and opened it, expecting a concerned neighbor or a relative checking in. Instead, she was met with a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his expression sharp and unreadable. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked. She nodded hesitantly. "I'm here to collect a debt." Sarah frowned. "I don't understand." "What debt?" The man's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Your husband owed a substantial amount of money to some, let's say, less forgiving lenders. And now that he's gone, that responsibility falls to you." Cold fear seeped into her veins. Michael had never mentioned any debts. Sure, they didn't have much, but they had always gotten by. "There must be some mistake," she said, shaking her head. "We don't owe anyone anything." The man chuckled, but there was no amusement in it. "I suggest you take a closer look at your husband's affairs, Mrs. Thompson. He owed a lot. And we expect payment." "I don't have that kind of money." Her voice wavered. "That's not my problem." His tone was flat, emotionless. "You'll find a way. Or else." He turned and left, leaving Sarah frozen in the doorway, heart pounding. Or else. The next few days were a blur of panic. She tore through their financial records, searching for answers. What she found made her stomach churn. Michael had been drowning in debt. Gambling, bad investments, she wasn't sure how deep it went, but it was enough to ruin her. She tried to plead with the lenders, explain that she was pregnant, that she had nothing to give. But they didn't care. The threats started small, phone calls, letters. Then they escalated. Men began showing up at her door, their presence looming like shadows, reminding her of what she owed. "You have a month," one of them told her, slipping a folded piece of paper into her trembling hands. She unfolded it, eyes widening at the impossible number written there. It was more than she could ever hope to pay. Sarah tried everything. She picked up extra shifts at the bakery, cleaned houses, did any job she could find. But no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. The stress became unbearable. She barely slept, barely ate. She was exhausted, constantly looking over her shoulder, terrified of what would happen next. Then one night, everything caught up to her. She was scrubbing the floors of a small diner when her vision blurred. The world tilted, and before she could steady herself, everything went black. When she woke up, she was in a hospital bed. A nurse stood beside her, checking her vitals. Her first thought was her baby's. "Are they?" she whispered, her voice weak. The nurse gave her a gentle smile. "They're fine. But you're pushing yourself too hard. You need to rest." Rest? What a cruel joke. How could she rest when the world was closing in on her? The threats weren't going away. The debt wasn't going away. And she was running out of time. 7 years had passed, but the weight on Sarah's shoulders had never eased. If anything, it had gotten heavier. She had done everything she could to survive. She worked day and night, taking whatever jobs she could find, cleaning houses, waiting tables, even scrubbing floors in the middle of the night. It wasn't enough, but it had kept her and the twins, Jacob and Lily, afloat. She had tried to protect them from the world she lived in, shielding them from the debt collectors, the threats, the fear that had become her constant companion. But no matter how hard she fought, the weight of Michael's betrayal never truly left her. Then came the job on the cruise ship. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough. A few months at sea, long hours, aching feet, but with a steady paycheck that would help her clear some of the debt. It was the best opportunity she had come across in years. She couldn't pass it up. Leaving Jacob and Lily behind was the hardest thing she had ever done. But she promised them, and herself, that when she returned, things would finally be better. She never expected to find him there. It was just another shift, another exhausting night of serving drinks to wealthy guests who barely noticed the staff. She moved through the dining hall, her tray balanced carefully in her hands, weaving between tables. And then she saw him. Michael. Alive. Sarah's body froze. Her breath caught in her throat. For a second, she thought she was imagining things, that her mind was playing some cruel trick on her. But it wasn't a trick. There he was, dressed in an expensive suit, his dark hair neatly styled, his posture relaxed and confident. He looked like someone who had never struggled a day in his life. And he wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was a woman, beautiful, elegant, laughing softly at something he had just said. She rested her hand on his, her fingers grazing his wrist in an intimate, familiar way. Sarah's vision blurred. This wasn't possible. Michael had died. She had grieved him, buried him in her heart, and spent years picking up the shattered pieces of the life he had left behind. And yet, here he was, alive and well, living a life that looked like it had never included her. Her hands trembled. The tray wobbled. Table 7, someone whispered behind her, nudging her forward. Somehow, she forced her legs to move. She placed the drinks on the next table, her fingers still shaking, then quickly turned and disappeared into the staff corridor, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Her mind was spinning. How? Why? Michael had faked his death. The realization hit her like a freight train. He had left her, left their children, alone to suffer, while he went on to live in luxury with another woman. Sarah felt sick. She needed answers. Hours later, after her shift ended, Sarah waited. She knew where he was staying, one of the ship's high-end suites. The kind of place people like her could never afford. She paced outside his door, heart hammering in her chest. Then she knocked. A moment later, the door opened. Michael stood there, his face unreadable. For a brief second, his eyes flickered with something, recognition, guilt, panic. Then, just as quickly, his expression hardened. "Excuse me," he said smoothly. "Do I know you?" Sarah's breath hitched. He was pretending. Her blood boiled. "Don't do this," she whispered. "You know who I am." Michael's jaw tensed. "I think you're mistaken," he said coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "How could you do this?" she hissed. "I thought you were dead, Michael. I spent 7 years grieving you. I raised our children alone. I was drowning in the debt you left behind. And you were here, living like none of it ever happened." His eyes darkened. "Keep your voice down." She laughed bitterly. "Oh, now you care about appearances?" Behind him, the woman, Claudia, appeared in the doorway. She looked between them, confused. "Michael? Who is this?" Michael straightened, slipping easily back into his cold, polished persona. "No one," he said firmly. "Just a misunderstanding." Sarah's heart shattered all over again. "No one," she whispered. Michael turned back to her. "This isn't the time or place." She shook her head. "I don't care about time or place. I want the truth. Why did you do it? Why did you leave me? Why did you leave our children?" His jaw clenched. For a split second, she saw something in his eyes, regret. But it was gone before she could be sure. "You don't understand," he muttered. "Then make me understand," she shot back. Michael exhaled slowly. "I had no choice." Sarah took a step back, feeling like the floor beneath her was crumbling. "No choice," she repeated. "That's what you're going with. You had a choice. And you chose to disappear." Claudia frowned. "Michael, what is she talking about?" Sarah let out a sharp breath. "Why don't you ask him? Ask him about the wife he left behind. The kids he abandoned." Claudia's face paled. Michael's expression tightened. "You need to leave." Sarah held his gaze. "This isn't over." Then she turned and walked away, her mind already racing with what she had to do next. Michael wasn't going to get away with this. Not this time. Sarah didn't sleep that night. After her confrontation with Michael, her mind refused to slow down. The shock of seeing him alive had been overwhelming, but now that the initial wave had passed, anger took its place. She had spent 7 years scraping by, doing whatever it took to survive. She had worked herself to exhaustion, sacrificing everything to keep Jacob and Lily safe. Meanwhile, Michael had been living in comfort, wrapped up in expensive suits, fine dining, and the affection of another woman. It made her sick. But anger wouldn't be enough. She needed proof of what he had done, proof that he had faked his death, proof of where the money had gone. So she started digging. The advantage of working on the cruise ship was access. As staff, she had ways of getting information guests wouldn't even think about. Sarah started small. She checked the ship's guest records, scrolling through the list of high-end passengers. Michael wasn't listed under his real name. Of course not. He had changed his last name, reinvented himself. But it was him. There, in black and white. Michael Carter. Her stomach churned at the sight of it. He wasn't just hiding, he had rebuilt his entire life. Next, she looked into Claudia. Claudia had booked the cruise using a black card, one that likely belonged to Michael. Sarah knew enough about money to recognize wealth when she saw it. Claudia's spending habits weren't those of a self-made woman. She was living off someone else. Michael. That was the key. Sarah needed to know where his money was coming from. If he had debts, if he had run from the Agiotas, then how was he affording this life? She reached out to an old contact, a man she knew from back home who had a knack for finding things people wanted hidden. It took a few hours, But when the reply came, it hit her like a punch to the gut. Michael hadn't just run from debt. He had stolen money. He had been part of a scam, one that had defrauded a wealthy businessman. When things got too risky, he disappeared. Faking his death had been his way of escaping both the authorities and the criminals he owed. He had cleaned out their accounts before he left. Sarah clenched her fists, fury burning through her veins. She had been left with nothing, not just emotionally, but financially. He had taken everything and left her to suffer. But now she had what she needed. She had proof. And she knew exactly what to do with it. Sarah had spent years fearing the Agiotas. Every call, every knock on the door had been a reminder that she was trapped. But now, she had leverage. She made the call. It wasn't easy. The man on the other end, the one who had sent enforcers to her home, the one who had threatened her, listened in silence as she laid out what she had found. Michael was alive. He had been hiding. He had money. And she could give them everything they needed to find him. A long silence followed. Then, the man spoke. "If you're lying to me, Sarah, you know what happens." Her grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not lying. I'll send you everything. His location. His records. His new name. You want what he owes? He's right here." Another pause. Then, "Send it." Sarah ended the call and exhaled shakily. It was done. The Agiotas were coming for him. And this time, he wouldn't escape. The next morning, Sarah moved through her shift as if nothing had changed. But everything had. She caught glimpses of Michael across the ship, laughing, drinking, living a life he hadn't earned. He had no idea that time was running out. It was almost poetic. The same fear, the same helplessness he had forced on her for years was about to catch up with him. By the afternoon, she saw them. The Agiotas had boarded the ship. They blended in with the other passengers, but Sarah recognized the coldness in their eyes. They weren't here to enjoy the cruise. They were here to collect. She kept her distance. She didn't want to be anywhere near Michael when they finally reached him. It didn't take long. Within hours, Sarah overheard whispers among the staff. A VIP passenger had been removed from the ship. Security had been involved, but the details were hush-hush. She knew exactly who it was. Michael was gone. Taken. Sarah didn't know exactly what the Agiotas would do to him, and she didn't care. For the first time in 7 years, she was free. For the first time in 7 years, Sarah felt the weight lift off her shoulders. Michael was gone. The man who had abandoned her, who had left her to struggle, who had stolen from her, he was finally paying for his choices. And for the first time, she didn't have to clean up his mess. Sarah wasn't naive. She knew there were still things to deal with. There were still bills to pay, and the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But for once, she had control. She wasn't waking up every day in fear, wasn't waiting for the next disaster to strike. She was free. The ship docked early in the morning. Sarah stood near the railing, her bag slung over her shoulder, watching as the city came into view. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. She hadn't seen home in months. But this time, she wasn't coming back as the same woman who had left. This time, she was stronger. Miss Reynolds was already waiting for her at the port, her old car parked in the same spot where Sarah had left weeks ago. When she spotted Sarah, she waved, her warm smile easing the last of Sarah's nerves. The drive home was quiet. Sarah watched the familiar streets pass by, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, nervousness, anticipation. And then, finally, they were there. Her apartment building looked the same as it always had, small, worn down, but home. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs. She could already hear them. The sound of giggles, of little feet running across the floor. And then, the second she opened the door, "Mommy!" Jacob and Lily ran straight into her arms, nearly knocking her over. Sarah dropped her bag and hugged them tight, burying her face in their hair, breathing them in. "I missed you so much," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We missed you too, Mommy." Lily clung to her, her tiny fingers gripping Sarah's shirt as if afraid she might leave again. Jacob pulled back just enough to look up at her. "Are you home for good this time?" Sarah cupped his face, brushing his hair back. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "I'm home for good." The next few weeks were a blur of adjustment. Sarah slipped back into the rhythm of everyday life, morning breakfasts, school drop-offs, late-night cuddles on the couch. The simple things she had missed so much. She found a new job, one that paid better, one where she wasn't constantly exhausted. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. Michael's arrest made the news. His past crimes, his fake death, everything was exposed. Sarah watched it unfold, but she didn't feel the satisfaction she thought she would. She just felt done. Done with the pain. Done with the anger. Done with the part of her life that had been defined by him. The past no longer had power over her. She had one. Looking forward. One evening, as she sat on the small balcony of her apartment, Jacob and Lily curled up beside her, she looked at the city lights in the distance. For the first time in years, the future didn't seem so uncertain. Jacob yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Mommy?" "Yeah, sweetheart." "Are we happy now?" Sarah smiled. She pulled them both closer, pressing a kiss to each of their foreheads. "Yes," she whispered. "We are." And for the first time in a long, long time, she truly believed it. Life didn't magically become perfect overnight. Sarah still had bills to pay. She still had to work hard, juggling motherhood and a job. Some days were exhausting, and there were moments when she felt overwhelmed. But there was a difference now. She wasn't living in fear anymore. For the first time in years, Sarah woke up without the weight of the past dragging her down. She didn't have to flinch when the phone rang, didn't have to worry about strange men showing up at her door. The debt was gone, the threats had vanished, and Michael was nothing more than a bad memory. Her focus was on the future now. Jacob and Lily were growing fast. They had their first school play, and Sarah sat in the front row, cheering them on with tears in her eyes. She helped them with homework, cooked their favorite meals, and on weekends, they had movie nights, snuggled up on the couch with popcorn and blankets. She had missed so much, but she wasn't going to miss another moment. One afternoon, as she picked them up from school, Jacob grabbed her hand and looked up at her with a grin. "You look happy, Mommy." Sarah laughed, ruffling his hair. "That's because I am, sweetheart." And she meant it. Sarah had spent so long just trying to survive that she had forgotten how to dream. But now, she allowed herself to think about the future. She started taking online courses at night, studying after the kids were asleep. She didn't know exactly where it would lead her, but she wanted to build something for herself, something more than just getting by. She wasn't just a woman who had been abandoned. She wasn't just a mother struggling to make ends meet. She was strong. She was capable. She was finally in control of her own life. And for the first time, she looked ahead not with fear, but with hope. The past was behind her, and the future was hers to create.